something just changed in the water. Not metaphorically, literally. In the last 60 minutes, a series of coordinated events in and around the Strait of Hormuz has set off alarm bells in shipping rooms from Singapore to Rotterdam that most people watching cable news right now have absolutely no idea about. And by the time the anchors catch up, the market implications will already be priced in by the people who were paying attention. This is Professor John. Hit subscribe. We're going deep. I want to start with the number, 20%. That is the share of all seaborne crude oil that passes through a single choke point, a narrow band of water sitting between the coast of Oman and the Iranian shoreline, at its tightest just 21 nautical miles wide. 21 miles. The width of a morning commute in traffic. And through that corridor, every single day, somewhere between 17 and 21 million barrels of oil move. Saudi crude heading to Asia. Emirati condensate heading to Europe. Qatari liquefied natural gas heading to markets that have no other viable source. The entire architecture of modern industrial civilization, the supply chains, the plastics, the fertilizers, the jet fuel, the heating oil, all of it traces some portion of its existence back to those 21 miles of water. That's not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. That is the structural reality that every serious energy analyst carries around in the back of their head every single day they come into work. And right now, at this exact moment, that corridor is under a level of stress that the public conversation has not caught up to yet. Let me tell you what happened. Reports began surfacing in the last hour, and I want to flag immediately that we are still in the confirmation window, the murky period where initial claims outrun verified facts. But the sourcing here is not social media noise. What's moving through defense and shipping intelligence channels right now points to a significant Iranian naval provocation inside the strait itself. The details are still assembling, but the shape of what happened follows a pattern that anyone who has studied Iranian asymmetric doctrine would recognize immediately. Fast attack craft, coordinated harassment of commercial tanker traffic, a disputed zone near the northern shipping lane where the deep water channel narrows and the margin for error shrinks to almost nothing. Now, Iranian harassment of tanker traffic is not new. The IRGC Navy has been doing versions of this since the tanker wars of the 1980s. But the timing of what happened today, layered on top of everything else that has been building in this region over the last several weeks, changes the calculus entirely. Because context is everything in geopolitics. And the context right now is as combustible as anything I have seen in years of tracking this region. Let me build that context for you, because without it, today's incident looks like a skirmish. With it, it looks like a potential trigger. Start with Iran's position. The regime in Tehran right now is operating under a level of simultaneous pressure that is genuinely unusual, even by the standards of a government that has survived 45 years of sanctions, wars, and internal upheaval. The economy is not just struggling. It is structurally degraded in ways that are now showing up in the daily lives of ordinary Iranians in ways the government cannot easily explain away. The rial has lost purchasing power at a rate that makes savings meaningless. Unemployment among young Iranians, particularly the educated urban population, sits at levels that no government with ambitions to legitimacy would tolerate if it had a choice. The protest movements that shook the country in 2022 and 2023 did not end. They went underground, and they are still there, waiting. Externally, the picture is equally compressed. The proxy network that gave Tehran strategic depth across the region has been eroding. Hezbollah's operational capacity is a fraction of what it was before 2024. The Houthis in Yemen, still active, still capable of disrupting Red Sea shipping, are fighting a war of attrition that is consuming resources Iran can less and less afford to supply. The Shia militias in Iraq and Syria have been on the receiving end of repeated precision strikes. The Axis was never a conventional alliance. It was always a web of influence and capability that Iran could pull on when it needed leverage. Those strings are fraying. And then there is the naval dimension, which brings us back to today. Over the last several months, a methodical and surprisingly underreported campaign has been reshaping the threat environment inside the Persian Gulf at the seabed level and at the surface level simultaneously. Mine countermeasure operations, coordinated between American assets, Saudi naval elements, and Emirati forces, have been working through the suspected Iranian mine deployment zones in a systematic way. The numbers that have come out of that campaign, if they are accurate, and I want to hold that qualification carefully, represent a significant degradation of Iran's most economically consequential asymmetric tool. The sea mine inventory. The capability that gave Tehran the ability to credibly threaten a sustained closure of Hormuz without firing a single ballistic missile or scrambling a single conventional warship. Here is why that matters for what happened today. If you are a regime that has watched a core piece of your deterrence architecture being dismantled over months, and you are looking for a way to signal that you are still a factor, still capable of imposing costs, still dangerous enough to be taken seriously at a negotiating table, what do you reach for? You reach for what you still have. And what Iran still has, even with a degraded mine inventory and a damaged proxy network, is the ability to make the strait feel dangerous. Not close it, not shut down 20% of global oil supply indefinitely, but make every tanker captain, every shipping insurer in London, every spot market trader in Singapore ask the question, is today the day something goes wrong? That question, the asking of it, is worth billions of dollars in risk premiums. And that appears to be exactly what happened in the last 60 minutes. Let me talk about what a Hormuz disruption actually looks like in market terms, because I think a lot of people have a movie version of this in their heads that doesn't match the mechanics of how energy markets actually respond to geopolitical stress. The movie version is Iran closes the strait, oil goes to $200 a barrel, gas stations run dry, civilization tips into chaos. The real version is more complicated and in some ways more insidious because it plays out more slowly and affects more parts of the economy in ways that are harder to trace back to a single cause. Here's how it actually works. The moment a credible disruption signal hits the market, and today's incident qualifies as a credible signal, you get an immediate reaction in the Brent crude futures price. Not because the oil has stopped flowing yet. The oil is still flowing. The tankers are still moving. But the risk premium, the extra cost that traders demand to hold an asset that might spike unpredictably, that gets repriced within minutes. We saw Brent futures move on this. The move at the time of recording reflects a market that is not panicking but is absolutely paying attention. Then comes the second order effect, and this one takes a few days to show up, but it's where the real economic damage starts to accumulate. Shipping insurance. The Joint War Committee at Lloyd's of London maintains a list of high-risk transit zones. When that list gets updated, and events like today's incident are exactly the kind of trigger that causes updates, the war risk premium for vessels transiting the Gulf moves dramatically. We are talking about additional costs of hundreds of thousands of dollars per voyage. For a supertanker making the run from Ras Tanura to a Chinese port, that cost gets passed somewhere. It gets passed to the refinery, then to the distributor, then to the pump, then to you. The third effect is the one that doesn't make headlines but may matter most over a sustained period: rerouting decisions. If the risk premium in the Gulf gets high enough for long enough, some cargo doesn't go through Hormuz. It goes the long way around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to the voyage, adding dramatically to shipping costs, adding to the effective tightness of global supply even if the physical barrels are still there. The world is not short of oil today. But the world can become functionally short of accessible, deliverable, priced-in oil without a single well going dry. That's the mechanism. And today's incident just moved that mechanism a notch closer to activation. Now I want to pull back to the strategic level because the market mechanics matter, but the bigger question is what today's incident tells us about where this is actually heading. There are 3 readings of what happened, and I think it is worth sitting with each of them honestly rather than reaching for the most dramatic interpretation. The first reading is, this is noise. Iran provokes tanker traffic periodically. It always has. Today's incident fits within the historical range of IRGC harassment operations. The system absorbs it, insurance premiums tick up temporarily, diplomatic back channels activate, everything normalizes in a week. This is the base case that the most experienced regional hands would probably default to, and they are not wrong to hold it. The second reading is, this is a signal. Tehran is deliberately injecting instability into the strait at this moment, specifically because of the degradation to its conventional and asymmetric capabilities that has been happening below the waterline for months. This is not random harassment. This is a message. The message is, we are still here. We can still make this expensive. Come talk to us or we will continue escalating through the options we have left. This reading would suggest that today's incident is the opening move in a coercive bargaining sequence designed to create urgency in diplomatic channels and extract concessions from a position of diminishing strength. The third reading is darker, and I do not want to sensationalize it, but I also cannot responsibly leave it off the list. It is the reading that some of the more cautious voices in Washington and Riyadh are privately entertaining. What if the coercive tools have degraded to the point where the regime feels it has nothing left to lose through restraint? What if what looks like a signal is actually the beginning of a pattern that escalates faster than anyone's containment strategy is designed to manage? Regimes under existential pressure do not always make the rational calculation. History has enough examples of governments that chose dramatic action over managed decline to make this possibility worth taking seriously. I am not predicting it. I am flagging it as a scenario that the market is not currently pricing and that the public conversation is certainly not having. Let me bring this down to the level that actually affects the people watching this. If you are an American consumer, here is what the next 60 to 90 days could look like under different scenarios. If today's incident is absorbed without further escalation, you probably see a $2 to $3 per barrel bump in Brent that fades within 2 weeks. Gas prices tick up a few cents, maybe a dime in the most exposed markets, and then drift back. Annoying but not economically significant. If today's incident is the first in a series of escalating provocations, the calculation changes. A sustained risk premium on Gulf transits, even without a physical disruption to oil flow, can add $15 to $20 per barrel over the course of weeks. That translates to roughly 40 to 50 cents per gallon at the pump. In an economy where inflation expectations are already not anchored where the Federal Reserve wants them, a food and energy price spike of that magnitude does not stay contained in the energy sector. It bleeds into transportation costs, which bleed into goods prices, which have a documented psychological effect on wage expectations, which feed back into the inflation dynamic that the Fed has been trying to manage for 3 years. This is not a hypothetical chain. This is exactly what happened in 2022 when the Russian invasion of Ukraine created a sustained energy risk premium that contributed materially to the worst inflation surge in 40 years. And if the scenario moves into actual disruption of physical flows through Hormuz, even a temporary one, even a 10 to 14 day closure of the northern shipping lane, you are looking at a Brent price that could test $140 to $150 per barrel on pure supply shock mechanics before strategic petroleum reserve releases, before emergency OPEC responses, before any of the policy interventions that would inevitably follow. The downstream consequences of a price move like that, sustained even briefly, are not manageable through normal monetary policy tools. This is why today matters. Not because the crisis is here yet, but because the path to a crisis that looks like that one is now 1 or 2 more steps shorter than it was yesterday. There is a piece of this story that almost nobody in the mainstream conversation is connecting, and I want to flag it because it will matter. Watch the gold market. Central banks around the world, the People's Bank of China, the Reserve Bank of India, several Gulf sovereign wealth vehicles have been accumulating gold at a pace that has no clean explanation inside conventional monetary theory. These are not inflationary hedges in the traditional sense. The pace and the pattern and the geographic clustering of the buyers suggest something more specific. A hedge against disruption to the dollar-denominated energy settlement system. Because the global oil market, the one that runs through Hormuz, the one we are talking about today, still settles in dollars. And the dollar's role in that settlement is one of the foundational pillars of American financial primacy. If the energy transit system becomes unreliable enough for long enough, the pressure to build alternative settlement mechanisms accelerates. That is not a prediction about the death of the dollar. It is an observation about incentive structures. And the gold buying pattern we are watching in real time is consistent with a set of major institutional actors quietly preparing for a world where those structures look different than they do today. That is a long game story, but the long game starts with moments like today. Here is what I want you to watch in the next 72 hours. Watch the official Iranian statement. If Tehran acknowledges the incident and frames it as a defensive response to what it calls foreign aggression in Iranian territorial waters, that is the language of coercive signaling. It means they want credit for the action and they want a conversation. If Tehran stays silent, if the state media doesn't touch it, that is a different and more concerning signal. Silence from an authoritarian government about a military action it conducted usually means either the operation exceeded its intended scope or the internal factional picture is more fragmented than outside observers appreciate. Watch the shipping data. The automatic identification system, the AIS transponder network that tracks commercial vessel movements in real time, will tell you more than any press briefing. If you see tanker traffic beginning to divert from the northern channel, if laden supertankers start adding hours to their transit routes to gain distance from the Iranian coastline, the market has made its own assessment before any government has said anything publicly. Watch what the Saudis say. Not the official statement. The official statement will be diplomatically careful regardless of what they actually think. Watch the output from Aramco's logistics operation. Watch whether Saudi export scheduling for next month's liftings shows any adjustment. That data is semi-public, and it is the signal of a sophisticated actor making its genuine operational judgment visible through behavior rather than language. And watch the options market on crude, not the spot price, the options. Specifically, watch the implied volatility on out-of-the-money call options on Brent for the next 60 to 90 days. If the smart money is pricing in a tail risk of a significant supply disruption, it shows up there before it shows up anywhere the average investor is looking. Let me leave you with the frame I keep coming back to when I think about what today actually represents. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a geographic feature. It is a stress test that the global energy system runs continuously. Most of the time, the test comes back clean. The oil flows, the tankers move, the insurance premiums stay within a range that the system can absorb, and the 21 miles of water between Oman and Iran remain, for all their latent danger, functionally open. What today's incident represents is not a failed test. Not yet. It is a result that came back with an anomaly, something in the numbers that makes the technician look up from the screen and look again. Could be nothing. Could be a one-time irregularity that gets explained away and forgotten. Could also be the early signal of a system moving toward a failure mode that the architecture was not designed to handle gracefully. The people whose job it is to watch that screen, the shipping insurers in London, the risk desks at the major oil trading houses, the intelligence analysts in Riyadh and Washington who spend their careers reading the traffic patterns in that narrow corridor, they are all looking at the same anomaly right now. None of them are panicking, but none of them are looking away either. That is the honest read of where we are. One incident, one moment, one data point that by itself means nothing, and in context means something that is not yet fully legible but is absolutely worth your sustained attention. The Strait has held for decades through crises that looked worse than this one on the surface. That history is real and it matters. But so does the context, and the context right now is unlike anything we have seen in a long time. This is Professor John. If this gave you something to think about, subscribe, because the next 72 hours are going to tell us a great deal about which of those three readings is the right one. And I will be here when we find out.